Hello and welcome to another episode of Word Mentality on Grammar and Thongs, where we look at the origin of words and phrases that have an unusual spelling in the hope that if you know the story behind the word or phrase, you'll remember the correct spelling. Today we're looking at Prince's Highway, which is that stretch of road from Sydney down the coast around to Melbourne and then on to Adelaide. And it is often misspelled as the Princess Highway. This is incorrect. It's an understandable mistake because it sounds a bit like the Princess Highway. But if you know that it's named for a prince, you'll hopefully remember that it's the Prince's Highway. We need to go back to World War I to understand the origin of this particular name. In World War I, the King of England was King George V, and he promised Australia that once peace was restored, he would send his son, the Prince of Wales, out to Australia for a royal tour to say thank you to Australia for their support during the war and also strengthen the ties between Australia and England. And so the war ended in 1918 and plans were made for the Prince of Wales to come out and tour in 1920. In Australia, everyone was very excited about the prospect of the Prince of Wales coming out. He was, after all, going to be the king. He went on to become King Edward VIII in 1936, although he only was on the throne for less than a year because he abdicated so that he could marry his love interest, a divorced American woman. But back in 1920, they didn't know any of that. They were very excited, and they had plans to make sure that the road between Sydney and Melbourne was good enough that the Prince would be able to travel overland during his tour. So the Prince came out in 1920. He was incredibly popular. He was very funny, apparently. He was quite informal. He had good conversations with people as he toured around. He spoke particularly well with the returned soldiers and was interested in their stories because he had fought in World War I himself. In fact, he was known as the Digger Prince, which was a great honour. So the tour was a huge success. It's hard to understand just how popular the Prince of Wales was during this tour of Australia. And he returned back to England in August of 1920. So that all makes sense. He travelled down this highway and so it was named the Prince's Highway, correct? Well, not quite, because they never got the roads up to the standard required. And so he actually travelled by ship between Sydney and Melbourne. But he had been so popular, there was still such a buzz around the place when he went back that there were plans to name this stretch of road the Prince's Highway anyway, in honour of his visit and in honour of the Prince himself. And so in 1920 there was a naming ceremony at Bulli Tops, and it was called the Prince's Highway with a possessive apostrophe because it was the highway of the Prince. Dignitaries travelled to Bulli by train and then they got in their cars, tried to drive up Bulli Pass, got about halfway up, conked out, it's a very steep road, walked the rest of the way, and there was a naming ceremony in which the president of Bulli Shire said at one point, "The Prince of Wales had captured the hearts of the Australian people, and by his gracious manner he had already made a highway to the hearts of the people," which is a nice little sentiment there. So it was the Prince's Highway, and it wasn't until 21 years later, in 1941, that the possessive apostrophe was dropped and it just became the Prince's Highway. Now, dropping the possessive apostrophe in a place name isn't unusual. If you think of Bateman's Bay, it doesn't have a possessive apostrophe. St George's Basin doesn't have a possessive apostrophe. And King's Road, which you find in many towns, usually won't have a possessive apostrophe either. So that's not unusual, but it does make it difficult in this case because it makes Prince's Highway sound like Princess Highway, and the fact that the possessive apostrophe isn't there can make it even trickier. But hopefully now you'll remember that it's the Prince's Highway without a possessive apostrophe and spelled that way. Thank you.